Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanek.
The Kennedy assassination was documented by several amateur films and still photographs. Enough to allow important information such as the shot sequence aid the investigation. But the Warren Commission never commissioned a detailed forensic analysis of the photographic evidence. The analysis, which was done by the CIA's Photographic Interpretation Lab, was not shared with the Commission. Only years later was proper investigative work done with the photographic evidence. Researcher Pat Speer uncovers the work of the House Select Committee's photographic panel.
This is Pat Speer, creator of the Mysterious Death of Number 35 video series and the author of a free book on the JFK assassination available at patspeer.com. One of the most persistent myths regarding the Kennedy assassination is that the Zapruder film shows evidence for but one shooter firing from behind. This myth is built upon the premise President Kennedy and Governor John Connally are hit at the same time, just as they come up from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign in the film. But those pushing this scenario in print and on TV inevitably fail to reveal a most inconvenient truth. The last government body to study the case, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, convened a panel of photographic experts in 1978 to study the film. This panel, headed by Calvin S. McCamey, former chairman of the American Society of Photogrammetry, concluded Kennedy was hit before he went behind the sign of the film. At approximately Zapruder frame 200, Kennedy's movements suddenly freeze, his right hand abruptly stops in the midst of a waving motion, and his head moves rapidly from right to his left in the direction of his wife. Based on these movements, it appears that by the time the president goes behind the sign at frame 207, he is evidencing some kind of reaction to a severe external stimulus. By a vote of 12 to 5, the panel determined that President Kennedy first showed a reaction to some severe external stimulus by Zapruder frame 207, as he is seen going behind a sign that obstructed Zapruder's view. By a vote of 11 to 3, the panel determined that Governor Connally first showed a reaction to some severe external stimulus by Zapruder frame 224, virtually immediately after he is seen emerging from behind a sign that obstructed Zapruder's view. So yes, it's true. The only panel of photographic experts to ever study the Zapruder film concluded Kennedy and Connally reacted about a second apart. Now, this is a big problem for those claiming Oswald acted alone. The FBI had established back in 1963 that the fastest one could fire Oswald's rifle with any accuracy was once every 2.3 seconds. If both reactions observed by the HSCA's panel were correct, well, then there had to be another shooter. Virtually everyone still pushing that Oswald acted alone completely ignore the photographic evidence suggesting Kennedy was hit before this time. And they ignore the substantial eyewitness testimony suggesting Kennedy was hit almost 2 seconds earlier, around frame 190. There's Kennedy's buddy, Dave Powers, riding the car behind Kennedy's and watching his every move. Powers told the Warren Commission, "The first shot went off and it sounded to me as if it were a firecracker. I noticed then that the president moved quite far to his left after the shot from the extreme right-hand side where he'd been sitting." And this leftward shift was noted by several others. Kennedy's close aide Kenneth O'Donnell, riding next to Powers, testified, "I noticed the slump. He'd been waving out the right side of the car and I noticed him slump over towards Mrs. Kennedy." Motorcycle officer James Cheney, riding at the Kennedy's right rear, also said, "We heard the first shot. I thought it was a motorcycle backfiring, and I looked back over my left, and also President Kennedy looked back over his left shoulder." Mrs. Kennedy's movements are equally suggestive. Just ask Phil Willis. Willis testified that he took this picture as a reaction to the first of 3 shots. It has since been proven that this photo was taken around frame 202 of the Zapruder film, more than a second before those claiming Oswald acted alone now claim Kennedy was first hit. Willis testified, "The president was smiling and waving and looking straight ahead, and Mrs. Kennedy was likewise smiling and facing more to my side of the street. When the first shot was fired, her head seemed to just snap in that direction, and he more or less faced the other side of the street and slumped forward." Is it just a coincidence that the computer simulations shown on television and purporting to prove Kennedy was first hit around frame 224 at the same time as Connolly invariably fail to show the movements of Mrs. Kennedy leading up to that time? The film shows Kennedy and Connolly react at different times and suggests they were hit by separate shots at frames too close together to have been fired by a lone gunman using Oswald's rifle.
The eyewitness consensus has Mrs. Kennedy turning towards her husband in response to the first shot. In the Zapruder film, Mrs. Kennedy is clearly and undeniably facing her husband as the limousine comes out from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. Governor John Connolly, as close as a witness as possible, consistently maintained until his death that he was hit by a second shot and the first shot struck President Kennedy before him.
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.